George Bernard Shaw said some wonderful things, and his reflections on the world still stand up a generation or two later. My personal favourite is that the world depends on unreasonable people for its progress. I guess that means we deal almost exclusively with unreasonable people at Gizmag, and this article is about another unreasonable man and his vision. His name is Lon Ballard. He's a former Caterpillar project engineer who now lives in Thailand, and he recently allowed me to drive his creation, which is a rather unique vehicle called the Spira. It's one of the finalists in the Automotive X-Prize, but its remarkably frugal fuel consumption and low emissions are only part of the vision of making it a car for the people. Lon has always had an eye for designing safer vehicles and has been sketching safer 2- and 3-wheeled designs since his first year studying engineering at the University of Illinois. His original ideas surrounded using a series of external airbags to protect the rider and pillion in the event of an accident, and his eureka moment came when he was sculpting a 1/10th scale model of a 3-wheeler he'd designed to incorporate external airbags supported by an aluminium exoskeleton. He was shaping the foam model, stood back to get some perspective, and while looking at the model he realised suddenly that it already had airbags, millions of them. And he subsequently embarked on a very different design journey using foam to build a protective capsule, a poor man's equivalent to the carbon fibre driver protection tub used in Formula One race cars. Once he'd witnessed firsthand the road carnage across Asia when he moved to Thailand, he began work once more on his rider protection ideas, and the vehicle I drove was the first prototype. The laminated composite tub is both the chassis and the bodywork. Start with the scooter, throw away the frame, and everything else is then bolted onto the tub, transforming a scooter into a tandem 2-seater, which retains all of the good aspects of a 2-seater motorcycle, principally low fuel consumption and ownership costs, and maybe quadruples the carrying capacity, and it also loses the worst aspects of the scooter, being poor rider protection. Despite its looks, it's incredibly light, just 302 pounds or 137 kilos, and hence its performance is very lively, even with the 125cc scooter motor that I rode it with, and much better than a small car. And one of the prototypes is currently being fitted with a Kawasaki Ninja fuel-injected 250 motor as work begins in earnest for the X-Prize competition. If you've never driven a car, or perhaps more importantly ridden a motorcycle in Asia, I can vouch that it is indeed an entirely different ecosystem. More than 90% of Asia's road users are motorcycle or scooter mounted, a far cry from not that long ago when bicycles were the mainstream road vehicle. But the big change in recent decades on Asian roads has been the proliferation of the motorcycle and the subsequent rise of the automobile. And behaviour on the roads mirrors that of the jungle, where survival probabilities in the case of an altercation are directly proportional to size, though in Asia, how much money and influence you have is the primary deciding variable in an accident. Having money means you're never in the wrong, and those with money drive cars and are effectively unaccountable. Money equals a big 4-wheel drive with a bigger bull bar and mafia-style tinted windows, which means diminutive housewives and frail elderly can and do drive like Rambo, with very little respect for their poorer cousins, and almost complete immunity for their actions. Public roads should be accessible to all, with safety and fundamental respect for humanity at the core. In most Asian countries, justice is only for the rich. Bullying and intimidation of smaller vehicles by larger ones is standard behaviour across Asia, and that's a significant part of this problem. But going further, do we just accept the road toll as the inevitable cost of doing business? Every news bulletin in the world carried the news of the Air France disaster in June, when 1 infant, 7 children, 82 women and 126 men perished. It was a tragedy, and the world held its breath for the victims, and our worst fears were realised when 218 souls were lost. But a much greater tragedy happens every single day on our roads, day in, day out, and it gets more every day. More people than that die every single day on Chinese roads alone. And while there was an outcry about the air disaster, we seem to accept a massive annual road toll as the price we pay for personal mobility, and maybe what we've been sold as a symbol of freedom, the motor car. because one person dies every 27 seconds on a road somewhere on the planet, which equates to a stunning rate of attrition. World War II was the greatest loss of life in humanity's long history, and 50 million people died in 6 years, a burn rate of roughly 9 million humans a year. Well, the road toll is currently 1.2 to 1.3 million and heading for 2 million or more a decade from now. The political ramifications of too many soldiers getting killed fighting wars in foreign lands are well known. Well, I was trying to find a way to highlight just how atrocious the road toll numbers are. One way to look at it is that 10 times more people die on the roads each year than in the entire 7 years of the Iraq War on both sides. Then I put together a list of the most fatal wars in history, divided the number of deaths by the number of years to get the burn rate, and then compared it with the annual road toll. Despite mankind's long and extremely brutal history of war, only 5 wars in history have killed more people per year, and if we include the annual numbers for the road toll each year, only 6 wars would make the top 20. And it got me thinking, why do we ignore the loss of such a large slab of humanity on the roads? Maybe it's because we've been conditioned by media and advertising to see the motor car as a symbol of personal freedom. Riding a motorcycle, you're 7 times more likely to die in a Western country than if you're driving a car, and it's 20 times more likely if you're riding a bicycle. In developing nations, those numbers would be much higher. Now, it's not the motorcycles that are colliding with other motorcycles that's the problem. It's the cars mixed with the motorcycles and the bicycles that are killing people. And it's the mix of the vulnerable and the invulnerable that's the problem. After spending time in Amsterdam this year for several weeks, where the bicycle is the central mode of transport and everything else revolves around that, I'm inclined to say let's do away with the car altogether, particularly in central urban areas, and give the aged and handicapped maybe electric assist and save a lot of effort all round. If we're going to have a more enlightened society for the good of all, maybe we need to rethink our relationship with motorised transport. The burden of road traffic injury is increasing dramatically each year in real terms, and something needs to be done. The people who are getting killed are the most active, the young, the most productive members of our society, and the resultant mass misery from a global road toll of 1.2 million human beings a year is worth thinking about. The devastation of the news that a brother or mother or father has been permanently incapacitated or killed, that the breadwinner won't be bringing home the bread anymore, or that the child that you've nurtured and loved to adulthood is dead or critically injured. We've only mentioned death until now, but there are another 50 million people seriously injured on roads every year, most of them in Asia too. The cost in societal terms is inestimable. How do we reconcile that the automobile wreaks such a massive toll and so little has been achieved in reducing it? Asia is the most populous region on Earth, and it's undergoing massive economic growth right now. Asian societies are growing richer, and this is fueling a rapid escalation in motorisation, with scooters and motorcycles making up the vast majority of sales due to their low cost and the suitable climate there. Many Asian countries don't have compulsory helmets, and there are no standards for helmets. Check out the helmet I was wearing. It was the pick of the bunch of those I was offered when I rented a motorcycle, and I reckon it'd have the impact absorption qualities of an ice cream container. Most countries in Asia, well, many countries in Asia don't even have licensing, and most of those that do have police forces which are too under-resourced to devote any attention to road rule infringements at all. There's no earn to be had chasing the locals on motorcycles for traffic infringements because they simply don't have enough money to make it worth the policeman's time. So as the Asian road population has soared, so has the carnage, and it's shaping up so badly that Western politicians will be patting themselves on the back for their relatively excellent road safety efforts. The really bad news is what's going to happen to Africa when its motorisation gets into full swing, because that's going to be potentially much worse again. Looked at in cold hard dollars, the global economic cost is around $500 billion US, $500 billion. The Asia Pacific region has 16% of the world's vehicles, and it accounts for almost half of the world's road deaths. The direct costs of road crashes in Thailand is around 3% of GDP. Now, Thailand is far more developed and civilised than many other Asian countries, certainly all of its neighbours, and the real situation is masked by a lack of accurate statistics. The toll in China, for example, is almost certainly much worse than we can see. Life is very cheap in many countries in Asia, and the numbers are rubbery, and you can't count on them being any better than Thailand, and perhaps significantly worse, up to 4% of GDP in the worst countries. In some Asian countries, the road toll comprised almost entirely of economically disadvantaged people. The segment of the population that rides motorcycles does so because they can't afford cars, and that consumes 75% of all medical resources allocated to hospitals, 90% in some of the worst countries. In most low and middle income countries, the economic costs of road crashes exceeds the amount of development assistance those countries receive annually. Now, that's your money, folks. Now, I'm not being mean. It's important that the richer countries share their wealth and resources more equitably with developing countries. I'm trying to highlight how out of hand the problem has become. Those countries are going backwards. While the Spira is a finalist in the Automotive X-Prize, where it will compete against far better funded automotive companies and universities to demonstrate its low fuel consumption and emission potential, it's the safety aspect which offers the greatest upside. Lon Ballard designed this vehicle to be safe and cheap to buy and run, and its environmental credentials are just a byproduct of those goals. So what's it like to drive? Well, I'd expected it to be far worse than it was. The machine I drove was the first prototype, and it was rough around the edges. The accelerator was a metal bar, and I chose to take my sandals off and drive barefoot so I could feel it a bit better because it was safer that way. The motor in the machine I drove was just 125, and so I was pleasantly surprised, indeed amazed, at how well it performed. It's mainly because it weighs a lot less than it looks like it does. The foam used is a close relative to the foam which most computers come encased in, so whilst it looked bulky, it's also quite light. So light, in fact, that it floats. Driving the Spira was more fun than I'd imagined, due partly to its agility and road holding and partly to its celebrity status on the roads. If it looks different to you, imagine what it looks like if you only know a road system with bicycles and motorcycles and more recently cars. To see something like this coming down the road painted Big Bird yellow. Spontaneous cheering from the locals, even before I'd reached them, was not uncommon during the day I spent on the Spira. That aspect and the curiosity factor is currently a two-edged sword because it's such a novelty that cars drive in very close proximity so the driver or passengers can get a closer look and take pictures and video. Stopping through a crowd, I was never short of anyone to talk to about it. If there's a downside to the size of the Spira, it's that you're low and suffer from poor situational awareness. In Western society, when Lon unleashes what he's calling version 2, cameras and screens will keep you fully informed, but for now I rather missed the higher seating position and the awareness that it offers. The agility and road holding of the machine were far better than I'd expected. As it was one of just a handful of Spiras in existence, I wasn't keen on bending it, so I exercised more than a bit of restraint. Like many hands-on development engineers, Lon is his own test driver, and when he hopped in the driver's seat though, he clearly knew its limits, and they were way beyond where I expected them to be. It should be said that he drives the Spira day in, day out, to work, to meetings, to his engineering facility, which is 30 miles away from his home over quite agricultural, rural Thai roads, and he drives it like a go-kart, exploring what might break when you push it to the limits. The weight of the Spira is so low that it changes direction easily, brakes far quicker than a car, and like a go-kart or a genuine race car, you can micromanage it around a corner, driving very quickly. In reality, driving it comes across as somewhere between a low and narrow sports car, a lot of go-kart in there, and maybe a bit of minimalist solar race car without the solar panelling. Everything is so minimalist it makes a Lotus look like a luxury car, a well-appointed luxury car, so it's all relative. but it also has features I've never experienced before. The day I drove it was very hot, so we returned to base after a few miles to remove and store the roof, which is the only option. You can't take it off and store it and still travel. And I'd suggest that when the Spira hits the market, it will almost certainly never be used with a roof, certainly in Asia. Removing the roof turned it into an open-top sports car where you can rest both elbows on the door sills, and once I'd reassured myself there was indeed a very solid roll cage incorporated into the seat, the additional airflow made things much more pleasant. Given the prototype Spira I rode used the brakes and suspension of a scooter, it coped surprisingly well with the potholed roads of rural Chonburi. Roads in developing economies get far less funding than those the majority of our readership are accustomed to, and are often littered with massive potholes, sudden broken surfaces, people with a small farmyard animal on the back, or an extended family coming your way in your lane. And I suspect that if the Spira is ever sold in kit form, which is a possibility given that second-hand scooters are universally available across Asia, there will need to be an upgraded spring and damping kit as part of the package, so you can cope with the emergency braking, potholes, etc. Those scooters are usually overcatered for with disc brakes. The Spira's extra weight and the lack of venting for the enclosed front wheel eventually took its toll and the brakes faded. So I eventually managed to run out of brakes, but only after it had been carrying two 80-plus kilo passengers and the additional weight of the foam tub for a couple of hours in 35-degree heat. In an environment where it's commonplace to find something coming towards you in your lane, be it a truck which can't be bothered waiting for the obstruction on the other side of the road to clear, or a motor scooter carrying a small family, or a couple of farmyard animals, or a year's supply of something, or a makeshift sidecar with a full outdoor catering facility, or some unfeasibly large, heavy and dangerous load, such as enough gas cylinders to blow up a small country, you need brakes that work. But I was carrying two big guys, and I suspect the reduced ventilation to the front disc was the real culprit. Lon has the ducting modifications well underway, but even then, given that Asia ingenuity will find all manner of things to fill up the Spira's carrying capacity, I think twin discs will be needed to consistently pull up the extra weight it will inevitably carry. Braking on the Spira required a little getting used to, as the left rear wheel does not have a brake in its current incarnation. So stomping on the foot-controlled rear brake is hence similar to performing the same action on a motorcycle with a sidecar, in that it tends to veer to one side under very heavy braking. The Spira's basically sound engineering and steering geometry disguises this somewhat, but it's a safety consideration which will add extra expense to remedy. For an upmarket spec model, braking on both rear wheels will be necessary. The Spira V2 is the one most of the Western world will be waiting for. In one incarnation, the Spira is a scooter-based, low-cost, highly efficient design for the masses, whilst it wouldn't take a lot to turn it into a wonderful, agile, safe and ever-so-sporting three-wheeled sports car with cooled seats and all modern conveniences and a wicked power-to-weight ratio. Those spindly wheels can actually, with the light weight, get it round corners so quickly it's hard to believe. Version 2 will come in time, but right now the focus is on providing a suitable vehicle at the lowest possible cost and taking most of the parts of a scooter and getting them into the most efficient form, and a lot of work is being done on better moulding techniques. Version 2 and air conditioning and sophisticated ducting is still some way away because the X-Prize is looming and taking a lot of Lon's attention on top of the continued development of version 1 for the masses. Lon's laminated tub idea is a very low-cost way of producing very safe vehicles very cheaply. It will ultimately yield a safe, economical car for the price of a motorcycle, and with 80 million motorcycles sold each year in the world, there's clearly a place for a vehicle just like the Spira, which offers a far safer alternative to the motorcycle at a similar price. At least the Spira will offer a vehicle that people in developing nations can afford, with the performance and low ownership costs of a two-wheeler and the carrying capacity and safety of a car. It will become more attractive to those people who are, after all, seeking amenity from their transport, not sport. Lon is seeking a partner to develop and manufacture the Spira. Probably a motorcycle manufacturer, but possibly such a vehicle could see a car manufacturer as well, so he doesn't have to get the more expensive route of breaking down existing machinery to create full machines and ultimately to purpose-build far higher spec models for Western markets. The Spira could easily become an electric vehicle with no local emissions produced and an even smaller carbon footprint. As we've said, Lon is a highly unreasonable man, and my money is on it happening with or without a partner, but it could be fast-tracked with the right partners and save hundreds of thousands of lives every year into the bargain. Amazingly, it's a design that could offer just as much to the developed world as to the developing world. Check the article for Lon's contact details.